today, no less. I'm sure our speaker today needs absolutely no introduction from me. Yes, so I won't. But Canon Angela Tilby has come up from Christchurch this morning to talk about Evagrius of Pontus. And you should all have a handout or access to a handout. Do raise your hands if you can't see one. Okay. So, without any further ado, let me introduce Angela Tilby. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
No.
Let's just check. Is that any better?
Yes.
Right. Do if you find me difficult to hear, do put up your hand, and I'll wonder what you're intending to impart, but I might then get the message that I need to speak up a bit, because I can be rather quiet. Thank you very much, Georgie, for your welcome, and it's very good to be here with you. I've been enjoying seeing bits of the other speakers so far on the video version that's been made, and it's good that these talks are getting out in that kind of way. Some of you will know I have a sort of media interest. I worked, my first formation, to use the proper term in the language of spirituality, was as a radio and television producer. I worked for the BBC for 22 years before I was ordained. So in a way, an awful lot of the way I've been formed is sort of media-centric. That fills people with horror quite often, but it's actually true. And then after that, I was ordained and I went to teach in the Theological College in Cambridge at Westcott House. And I was there for 10 years as a tutor, as a teacher in early church history and spirituality, and a little bit in Anglicanism, because we couldn't find anybody to do that course, so I ended up quite useful, actually, things you pick up on the way. And then I was a vicar in central Cambridge for 5 years, and then came here to be a canon at Christchurch and to look after the clergy ministerial development programmes that the diocese runs. So that's me, and the subject, Evagrius of Pontus. I wonder how many of you have, this isn't a sort of test, how many of you have ever heard of Evagrius? You don't have to say yes if you haven't, it's fine, it's all right. The fact that he's not really known, or it's just a name, is actually his fate in the world, and I'll explain why. We're back in the 4th century with Evagrius. I think he's the earliest of the topics that you'll have been looking at during these lunchtime talks. And almost everybody in the whole world of Christian spirituality owes something to Evagrius, but the vast majority have probably never heard of him, or he's simply been a name, for the very simple reason that he was condemned 3 times as a heretic in 6th, 7th and 8th ecumenical councils. The reasons for that I'll explain as we go on, but it has meant that he's been rather demonized both in the Western Church and in the East. And although his teaching has survived, it's survived in some very strange ways, which I'll also try to explore with you a bit. But he is, I think, now being discovered, recovered as a figure of enormous significance, of a great theologian and a great spiritual teacher whose interest was really the dynamics of the spiritual life, the psychology of prayer and of spiritual development. And in that, his teachings have come down in hidden and mysterious ways and have influenced the life of the church and the life of other mystics all the time, but he's disappeared as a figure almost entirely. So there's a bit of reconstruction to be done before we can really get hold of what it was he was doing. And I'll try to explore some of that. Now, my interest in him started when I was in the Theological College at Westcott House. And it started in this way. I was very familiar with people, sometimes in their early 20s, sometimes much older, coming into training for the ministry of the Church of England, who had seemed to be quite fragile self-esteem in classic terms, very often, there was anxiety about who they were and the validity of their vocation. Sometimes quite a long history of doubts and uncertainties, all of which is very understandable, given that they're making a big change and transition in their lives. But where I always ran across a complete sort of brick wall was whenever it started, and we'd never had the conversation really, it's one of those things that you can't say, about the language of sin. Sin is a huge problem in the Western Church. What it is, what it means, what we do about it. If I do a bit of awful shortcutting, it's a huge problem in most of the Western Church. It isn't among those who have been had their Christian formation in the evangelical world, where, and I'm going to say something that you may disagree with, sin becomes a hugely important part of the construct of conversion and Christian life. But my theory is, this is my theory, that the way of thinking about sin that is typical in the evangelical world is pretty theoretical, really. It explains a whole lot of stuff, like how Jesus died for our sins and how we're free to serve him and all the rest of it. But if people really believed emotionally what they thought intellectually about sin, they would all be in mental hospitals. You know, the evangelical view of sin is pretty dark, pretty dire. And of course the trouble is, vulnerable people in that constituency of the church who do take it on emotionally because they're depressives or have other problems of that kind, get overwhelmed very easily. So forgive me going on a little bleat in that direction, but there is a problem about sin that we've somehow inherited. And with my ordinands, I thought, what is it? What is going on here? There must be something about the sin tradition that has sort of gone wrong, that isn't quite speaking to contemporary consciousness. Now, shortly after that, I was invited by the Dean and Canons of Westminster Abbey to give a series of Lent sermons, which was an exciting thing to be asked to do. And I thought, I'll really try to wrestle with this, and I'll try to get into that thing which I know about from the Western Church, the deadly sins, the 7 deadly sins, you know, that surely that will give me some sort of an answer to why sin is such a problem. And so I started reading around the history of the deadly sins, and I came across an Orthodox scholar, Andrew Louth, who's now at the University of Durham, who had opened up the world of the Desert Fathers in a book called The Desert, or The Wilderness, I think it was called, The Wilderness of God. And he was the first person to draw my attention to one of the key things about Evagrius, which is that Evagrius had a sense that the roots of what we call sin are what Andrew Louth calls cracks in the heart. And I found that phrase extraordinarily poignant, really. It had a different kind of quality to it from the, sin as a sort of breaking of the law or a sort of criminal act against God. Cracks in the heart suggested areas of vulnerability. And that seemed to me to tie up much more to what my ordinands were experiencing. Cracks in the heart, I liked that language, I thought there was something there. And so I began to look into Evagrius and to try to rediscover, piece together what he had actually taught. The other thing that Andrew Louth said about Evagrius was that he had produced a diagnostic tool for the spiritual life, for understanding the dynamics of the spiritual life. And as soon as I heard the word diagnostic, I thought this links into a whole lot of imagery and thinking that comes to the world of medicine. So we're talking really about healing, about diagnosis, about vulnerability, about weaknesses, rather than the Western language of sin, which is forensic, criminal, law-based. Different world. Do you agree? Do you find that convincing? So the search for Evagrius' teaching began, and this took quite a long time because there wasn't very much available in English or in an edited form. I then quickly discovered that quite a lot of what he wrote was actually around, but ascribed to other people. For example, in the Philokalia, which is a collection of Orthodox texts in the Eastern Church, put together in the 18th and 19th centuries, 18th century collection of originally Greek texts. There was a great collection of chapters, that is sayings on prayer, which were actually incorrectly attributed to another desert father, Nilus of Sinai, not to Evagrius. And the only writings on the deadly sins in that collection were from John Cassian, who was a monk who took some of Evagrius's teachings and brought them to the West and expanded them in his Latin monastic institutes. So it was quite difficult to find the authentic voice, and I eventually found a 1972 translation of the English text of a work of Evagrius called the Practicos, published by the Cistercians in America. And I began my research based on this. It seems extraordinary to me that this text wasn't more widely known. In fact, it is quite widely known in monastic circles. It's always been quite widely known in monastic circles because I've handed down and treasured and read and learnt from. But it's never one of those works that sort of spread out into the wider world. And the interest very much is becoming, the problem very much is because of Evagrius's controversial name and history. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, there are people who see him as a kind of Buddhist, who think he's not really Christian at all, he's not quite sound on the Trinity or the Incarnation. For others, and I tried to do this when I did some real study into Evagrius, he's got caught up, very unfortunately, in a tremendous political and theological debate in the 6th century, when the Byzantine Church was really trying to throw off any shadow of the learning that came from the Greek classical tradition. So anyone associated with Plato was out. It was a bad time for a sort of wider interfaith, more universal look on the human condition. The aim of the emperor and of the bishops was to purify the church from all heresies, from any lingering influence from Judaism, from any kind of influence from the heresy of Arianism, and along with it, the whole kind of Platonic classical tradition came under suspicion. And so Evagrius got caught up with that and was roundly and routinely condemned, along with the great Bible scholar Origen, who was his great inspiration. And I think it wasn't entirely fair. There is a genuine controversy about some of his Trinitarian thought, which is unresolved. I tried to make a good case for saying that he was not a heretic, but I'm not sure if I've entirely succeeded. But what he is sound on, and nobody I think really doubts this, is that his psychological insights into the nature of prayer and the spiritual process are very profound indeed. And they are very well worth uncovering and looking at again. So what do we know about him and his life? Because Evagrius of all people is one whose teaching is based on his own story. Well, there are some sayings of his that survive in the collection of sayings from the Desert Fathers, which have been published as a Penguin edition of them, one done by Benedict Ward, an earlier one by Helen Waddell, very easily accessible. But perhaps more useful is a longer, but still rather short, life of Evagrius by Palladius, the court biographer, and the Lausiac history. Evagrius is one of the holy people that he takes on and tells us about him. So here we are in the 4th century. Constantine the Great has put the end to the age of persecution at the beginning of that era and moved the imperial capital from Rome to Constantinople. Constantinople, Byzantium, now Istanbul. For the first time, Christianity became sort of respectable, and clerical life was a possible career path. You could actually have quite a good life, and it suddenly became something that ambitious young men were very keen to follow. Of course, when you get that kind of movement, that change in the fortune of a religious group who had not always persecuted, had always been thought of as somewhat less than equal, it brings a counter-reaction in its wake. And the more respectable Christianity became, the more it became an urban religion, the more it became something for the socially ambitious to hitch their wagon to, the more there was a sense among ordinary Christians that the heart of it had been betrayed. and a counter-movement of monasticism and withdrawal took off from, probably it started before the 3rd century, but by the middle of the 4th century it was absolutely enormous. The Egyptian desert became home for a huge and extraordinary ragbag of people. I mean, some were there for very inappropriate reasons, really, to avoid military service or to get out of a marriage they didn't want to take on. There were prostitutes who were repenting of their ways and wanting a new start. Some avoiding taxes, that never changes. But the Egyptian desert became also a place of refuge for people fleeing what they saw as the corruption of life in the city. Now, some of these were illiterate peasants, people who were not looking for any sort of intellectual version of the faith. But among them, there were also thoughtful and scholarly people who just wanted a completely different way of life and wanted to follow Christ in a much more straightforward way. So the desert, it's been said that the desert became a city, said Athanasius, who chronicled this period. The desert became a city. It has been estimated that perhaps even up to 500,000 people in the middle of the 4th century were living as monks or hermits in the Egyptian desert, sometimes in groups, sometimes on their own. And there were very many kinds of experiment into a life of solitary withdrawal and poverty as a way of following Christ. Now, after Constantine's death, his successors, with one notable exception, Christianized the empire more and more. This was the age of doctrinal formulations and doctrinal controversy. The Council of Nicaea defined the divinity of Christ and did a first draft, we might say, of the Nicene Creed, which we still use today, which was completed at Constantinople in the Great Council in 381. One of the people at that council, sort of research assistant for the former bishop, Gregory Nazianzen, and then following him for his successor, Nectarius, was Evagrius, a young man who had been born in Ebora, in Pontus, now Turkey. His father had been kind of country bishop, a travelling bishop who had pastoral care of some of the communities in the Pontus region. Evagrius was clearly very bright. He was made a reader, a lector, and then a deacon, possibly by Basil, the great bishop of Caesarea. And he may at that time have adopted some form of religious life. But in the late 300s, 379, Gregory Nazianzen invited him to help him with putting together the agenda for the Council of Constantinople. And Evagrius acquired a reputation for being a tremendously fierce opponent of heresy. He also met at the Council of Constantinople with a third of the characters known as the Cappadocian Fathers, Gregory of Nyssa. It was Basil, Gregory Nazianzen, and Gregory of Nyssa, the three great Cappadocians who were hugely important with formulating the doctrine of the Trinity. Anyway, he was known as, and this is one of the Lausiac Histories Palladius's remarks about him, a destroyer of heretical twaddle. He also, Palladius tells us, and so do some other biographers, he was rather a good-looking young man, liked to dress well, was quite smart and attractive and witty. And as might happen, he fell in love, rather disastrously, with the wife of a married man, a magistrate. And this could have entirely wrecked everything for him. Fortunately, he was rescued by a deeply psychologically intense dream in which an angel came and said to him, your deaconship, you shouldn't be staying around here any longer because you're going to get into enormous trouble if you do. I can see you in prison, locked up, and losing everything. Get on a boat straight away and go to Jerusalem. And Evagrius did just that. He saw that he had got into deep difficulties. And so he set sail and arrived in the Holy Land and was immediately taken up by a remarkable woman called Melania, who looked after with her brother Rufinus a monastery at the bottom of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Melania took him in and listened to his story and promised to help, but it wasn't long before he was wandering down into Jerusalem and getting into difficulties once again. And he then developed a sort of psychosomatic illness, and eventually Melania managed to get the whole story of his fall from grace from him. And she said, you can't wait any longer, you're off to the desert, it's the only way you can be cured of your immoral, improper inclinations. So I have to say for him, he obeyed, and he went off into the Nitrian desert in Egypt and spent 2 years really training in community for the monastic life. He always intended to become a solitary, to become a hermit, but he wisely trained for the life in community with others. He had a lot to unlearn there, and it was clear that the monks around him did what they could to beat him up a bit, actually, sort of emotionally and spiritually. There's a story that at one point he was at a community council when a controversial issue came up. He was asked his opinion, which he gave very fluently, as you would expect, only to be told to shut up. He might be important in Constantinople, but he was of no significance here whatsoever. He had a spiritual director, Macarius the Great, went to him one day and said the classic thing that he said if he were above in spiritual life in the 4th century, was, what can I do to be saved? And Macarius said, don't speak until you're spoken to. Now all this was pretty hard stuff. I mean, it's the kind of way people are trained when they go into the army, you know, that you cut down the self-image that is overweening. And it's a very brutal way of cutting people down to size. But Evagrius was able to cope with it, and he listened and he learnt. And after about 2 years, he went off into the deeper part of the desert, where he made his living by copying manuscripts. He had very nice handwriting, apparently. And he also began writing, he began giving spiritual counsel. And in quite a short time, he became very well known as a tremendously insightful pastoral and spiritual guide. Someone to whom you could go and say how your life of prayer is going without being made to feel ridiculous or without being put down. He was much gentler to others than others have been to him. So his reputation grew. He did live a very austere life, and this is all chronicled by Palladius. It's always difficult to know how much is exaggerated, but he gives you the picture. He had a pint of oil every 3 months and a pound of bread a day, and that was about it. No vegetables, no fruit. He was chronically dehydrated. He later in his life had kidney stones and terrific digestive problems, but I want you to think of him as a 4th century person, not as a 21st century person. He thought, as people did if they embarked on this way of life, that by working with the body, it wasn't that they hated the body, it wasn't anything quite as straightforward as that. The body was the kind of key, the doorway into a massive transformation of the self. If you could somehow make the body transparent to the Creator, to nature, somehow things would come together and the soul would be affected and you would be more whole. There was a sense, I think, in these people that they were going back to Eden, going back to how the first man and woman had been in God's mind and in God's creation before the fall. If you could get far enough away into nature, into a place of great simplicity, somehow with the help of God and the work of the Holy Spirit, you could be reformed. And that was really what he was, I think, trying to do. One of his most popular writings was called the Antiretikos, and it was a book that means how to answer back. And how to answer back was what you do when you're attacked by demons of temptation. And he wrote a whole lot of Bible texts that you could fling out at aggressive demons who were tempting you to do something that you knew you shouldn't. It's lovely work, actually. It's really, really interesting, the things that he strings together, which was supposed to utter and take the temptation away. So he's thinking all the time about how do How do you sort of measure up? How do you find the things which unbalance the spiritual life? How do you analyse them? How do you diagnose them? How do you knock them on the head so that they stop disrupting and disturbing them? And that's really what he's always trying to do. He may have had some medical training, or at least he was aware of the tradition of Greek medicine in the classical world, because his advice is always to begin, as you would if you were a doctor, with observing the symptoms. First thing you need to do is to measure out what are the things that are becoming really difficult. Now, in a way, going to this in the first place is making yourself vulnerable to all kinds of psychic distress. Just think about it. You're alone, and you're really, really alone. I mean, there's no sex, there's no companionship, there's no other people. Food is scarce, and you don't eat very much anyway. The day is very long. It can be very hot in the day and very cold in the night. You don't necessarily have much in the way of shelter. You're exposed on all kinds of levels, not only physically, which is bad enough, but also psychically, of course, to the things that pop up into your mind under extreme conditions, which will come up and disrupt any attempt you might have to pray. And what are those things going to be? Well, they're going to be memories to start with. Suddenly, I love a gin and tonic. I love a cup of tea. That kind of very obvious creaturely need. And then I'm lonely, I want someone to talk to. I'm going mad here on my own. It's all right talking to God, but actually, it's hard. All those kind of things. Feelings of rage. Rage perhaps at people in the past who have made life difficult for you. Rage perhaps against other brothers and sisters in the spiritual life who you spent some time with a little while ago and said something appalling which you don't want to think about for 3 years or so. All these things are around, and you're much more vulnerable to them in that place of extreme withdrawal than you would be in normal life. Nevertheless, there was this strong view on the part of the Desert Fathers that only by this extreme withdrawal would they begin to understand what it was to have a relationship with God. That's where it would be deepened and made. Now, I need to explain a bit of theology here, which takes us into the controversial waters about whether he's a heretic or not, but it's important for the way Evagrius drew up his diagnosis of what's wrong with us. There was a big controversy while Evagrius was in the Egyptian desert. It's sort of overstating it a bit to say it was a controversy between simple, uneducated peasant monks and intellectual, bright ones like Evagrius, but it was a bit like that. And there was a view among some of the simpler and less literate monks that was very dearly held to, that God was really like a large human being. And they believed that because of the biblical language of us being made in God's image. They argued that if we are the image of God, then God actually is also our image. God must be a bigger version of us. And to them this was incredibly obvious and spiritually extremely important. But it was always controversial among those monks who had more theological education and thought of God as being without hearts and passions, without a body, without sense organs in the way that we do. And it came to a bit of a head in the time that Evagrius was in the desert. The local bishop, Theophilus of Alexandria, didn't help matters because he changed his mind on the issue. First of all, he promulgated a decree to the effect that God had no images. God was completely beyond form or image and could not be worshipped as a human being. One monk, when this news of this promulgation reached him, said, "It's tragic, really. They have taken away my God, and I have no one I can hold now, and I know not whom to adore, nor whom to address myself." It was very pastorally sensitive of the bishop, but he wanted to keep up with the other lot. So that was, and then of course when he realised, and he virtually had a riot on his hand because all the monks who had thought in this rather literalistic way about God besieged him in his palace, and he instantly changed his mind and decided that those who denied that God had image and form and shape, that they were wrong. And Evagrius got sort of caught up in the nexus of this and its aftermath, because he was clearly one of the ones who had a more sophisticated theology, and it left its trail in its wake. Now, part of the reason why Evagrius held to the immateriality of God, he felt, and I think there's some reality to this, that the things which trouble us are very often based on mental images. I think that from our point of view of knowing a bit about psychology, we can understand this, that we have all, from our earliest days in this life, before we had anything like language, been tremendously vulnerable in terms of basic hungers and needs. And this sense of vulnerability, of neediness, of rage, you see all these things on a new frustrated baby's face, leave an impression on us, an impression which is linked to emotion. There's a great deal of emotion carried in all of this, and also often imagery, which is fairly unconscious. It doesn't go around with us all the time, but it's kind of there and around in our unconscious mind, comes out in dreams perhaps sometimes. So Evagrius felt that in a way, the whole image life of the unconscious mind needed to be somehow clarified and calmed, and that we had to, in prayer, the journey of prayer was to move through images and eventually beyond them. He doesn't reject images altogether. He loves the Psalms and feels that we should use the Psalms a lot. And the Psalms sort of open up to us the whole panoply of God's work in nature and creation, history and all the rest. And that we pray the Psalms in order to go through and immerse ourselves in this image-laden world. But then, at the end of a psalm, there's a moment of calm. And that's a profound moment of stillness which you reach, of contemplation, where everything is stilled and withdrawn into itself, and God alone is present. So that's the kind of trajectory he sees for the life of prayer. And you can see that all these disturbing things that come up on the surface of the mind, the spontaneous thoughts and feelings that are laden with emotion and memory and imagery, are things that you really have to work through. They're not in themselves sinful at all, but you do have to observe them and see where they're leading and work through them in some kind of systematic way. And that's really the beginning of the 8 thoughts, which I've given you in a sort of table form, in this green sheet. They are, if you look at them, classic deadly sins, which you know from the Western tradition, but Evagrius formulated them first, long before they got to Gregory the Great, who was the first person to put the deadly sins, 7 deadly sins, in a codified form. Evagrius had 8 of them, and he called them not sins, and this is really important, he called them thoughts, logismoi. Logismoi usually means bad thoughts or evil thoughts, but there is a sort of neutrality about it, more than there is about sin. There are 8 sort of disturbing thoughts, 8 passionate thoughts, and by passion it means not something good, which we tend to mean by passion, but something which is out of control. You're driven by something which you have no say in, really. And those aspects of our lives where we are driven by compulsions, by images, by memories, by emotions, are ones which we need to work through to come to wholeness and sanity. Now, I love the way he talks about these 8 logismoi, because there's a sense of humour and distance, which for somebody living in the 4th century, the fact that it communicates itself today, I find very extraordinary, but also incredibly insightful. Let's just go through them briefly, if I may. Gosh, I'm running out of, I already can't pass it on. I must leave some time for questions, but I would like to just tease them out with you, because I think they are extraordinarily interesting. The first one, the thought of gluttony, when you can read it in detail, but suggests to the monk that he should give up his ascetic discipline at once. It brings to mind the state of his stomach, his liver and his spleen, the diagnosis of a long illness, the lack of life's necessities. In other words, gluttony is about hypochondria. It's about when you're feeling a little bit teeny-weeny bit hungry, you start thinking of all the terrible things that might be wrong with you, and all the terrible things that might happen to you if you don't eat straight away, or at least fairly soon. And all sorts of other things happen once you're in the grip of gluttony. You get a visit from an unfortunate monk who left the life because he did become ill from fasting, and all these sort of things happen, and you panic and think, oh, this absolutely is not for me. Now, there's a kind of humour in this, but there's also a terrific reality. When I read this, I was thinking about our obesity crisis and about how our food manufacturers have actually conspired to make sure that people suffer really badly from blood sugar problems, hunger pains, because they're so sort of choked up on sugar and salt and fat by junk food, that there's a sort of panic almost, if you can't eat. And I think a lot of these eating disorders come from exactly the kind of hypochondriacal panic that Evagrius depicted. However, so that's number one, and you're always going to be hungry in the desert. You've got to find some way of dealing with lack of food. Lust, if you think that porn is a problem for the young today, Evagrius was there first. The way the imagination is drawn into sometimes demeaning, quite perverse, quite nasty sexual activities which become very compulsive, which can drive one. It's a description, it's quite a brief description, there's a lot more to say about lust in other parts of his work. But you can see also for somebody trying to live a life basically on their own, how incredibly debilitating constant attacks of lust could be. I mean, we don't go for lust really in the way that the Desert Fathers and the Christian tradition sometimes has. We don't see it as in quite such negative terms as they do. And I can only really think that this is because, I mean, you can imagine in the ancient world, an unwanted pregnancy, that was an absolute disaster. And it was much more likely to happen than it is in ours. But you wouldn't have had a high view of sex really, anyway. Whatever you were like. And one finds if you read contemporary accounts of secular figures, Roman emperors, other such people, you sort of had to have children, so you had to have sex, but actually once you reach the age of about 39 and were no longer so inclined to do it as you had been at 18, it was rather a relief really. I mean, this was the culture that early Christianity grew up in, so you can't entirely blame the early Christians for negative attitudes to sex. It's what they inherited and what they passed on. But it was obviously an issue in the desert, and there's loads and loads of stories of desert monks being constantly attacked by lustful thoughts, often memories too. Don't forget, Evagrius had left his potential mistress in Constantinople. I expect he had the odd bout of lust from time to time. And going on to avarice, this is one, again, which I think speaks to us in an extraordinary way. Our image of avarice is very often that of the miser hoarding large amounts of gold, or of bankers doing dreadful things with interest rates and all the rest of it, and speculators on the markets. What bothers Evagrius is something much more modest and something much more insidious. What happens when I get old? When I can't earn my keep and can't write manuscripts anymore? Who's going to keep me? Life is uncertain. There will be famines and illnesses and poverty, and the terrible shame of having to accept the necessities of life for others. This is basically about security. It's about how do I make myself secure. Almost everything in our financial industry drives us towards making ourselves secure. It's the way we're all brought up to feel is responsible and a good thing to do. But Evagrius sees here the roots of an avaricious attitude, which is very easy to develop out of the compulsion to be secure. All right, I've got enough for the next 5 years, but maybe I'll get the next 5 years after that. Supposing I live to be 90 instead of 80, how do I calculate my finances so that I don't ever have to worry, so nothing can go wrong, because that's really what I want, total control, so I know there's not going to be a problem ever. He understands the root of that problem. And avarice is not about excess, it's about ordinary everyday attitudes which we all have. And actually, he feels, and I can understand this, it stops us from being free. Because disasters do happen. And we've got to learn to trust no matter what. It's quite radical, this stuff, as you can see. You'll be surprised to find sadness in the list, But for Evagrius this is quite important because this is about nostalgia and about memory and about that awful habit that we always have to think things were better in the past. My unbelievably happy childhood. I did prefer the job before last. Things were so much better when I had my full mobility and I was able to do everything I wanted to. And then sort of indulge in sort of nostalgic memories which in a way are very agreeable but then leave you very sad because they're not available anymore. He's very aware of that nostalgia and what a terribly debilitating condition it can be. And feels that that's something which one has to guard against very carefully by living in the present, by being ruthlessly orientated on God in the here and now. Anger is one he has quite a lot to say about. And his psychology of anger, I think, is, again, it's very interesting. Defined as a boiling and stirring up of wrath against one who is given injury, or is thought to have done so. Notice that. It doesn't even have to be real. Resentment can be felt unjustly. Anger irritates the soul, and above all, at the time of prayer, never happened to you this, it seizes the mind and flashes the picture of the offensive person before one's eyes. They're getting to a prayer life. I cannot pray because I'm so angry, so cross with X who has made my life so miserable. There comes a time when it persists long. He then describes how anger turns into total paranoia, and ends up in sort of mental disintegration of the kind. Sloth is a good one for the desert because you get such long and tedious and the same all the time days. The noonday demon. He makes the day seem 50 hours long. You get this poor monk watching the sun. Is it got a little nearer to the middle because that's when I can have my midday meal and it's still 8 o'clock in the morning and that sort of thing. You'll have done this from time to time. You want something to happen. You wander to the window, you wander back again. Nothing's happened. How long is this going to go on? That kind of thing. And then it affects monks in the way of thinking, well, I'm in the wrong place. If I only moved a couple of miles down the road to another sort of wadi in the desert, perhaps it would be better. Perhaps if I was dimly connected to a monastery in northwest instead of southeast, there'd be nicer people there. That kind of thing. And he just somehow can't quite hack the fact that this is going to go on much the same for a long, long time. And sloth isn't just laziness, it's that kind of place in the present where you're entirely restless but entirely unable to do anything. That make any sense? Yes. Without decision, without purpose. It's a very good teenage condition. Teenage boys get into sloth, as you know. And perhaps that's physically necessary because, as we now know, their brains are being completely rewired in teenage time. So perhaps they're let off and excused. And then the last two, vainglory and pride. Vainglory is lovely because you can think that Evagrius, with his natty dressing and the rest of it, probably was quite prone to this. It's most subtle and it readily grows up in the souls of those who practice virtue. It leads them to desire to make their struggles known publicly, to hunt after the praise of men. This in turn leads to their illusory healing of women, or their hearing fancied sounds as the cries of demons, crowds of people who touch their clothes. This demon predicts they will attain to the priesthood. It has men knocking on the door, seeking audience with them. If the monk does not willingly yield to their request, he is bound and led away. When in this way he is carried aloft by vain hope, the demon vanishes and the monk is left to be tempted by the demons of pride or of sadness. Yes, the fantasies of fame based on your own virtue, good character, spiritual gifts, all the rest of it. Quite a temptation for a lot of people in ministry. Read the pages, letters of the Church Times, and you'll know that vainglory is a sin that is fairly familiar among the clergy of the Church of England, and I'm sure elsewhere as well. Pride, lastly. Evagrius doesn't begin with pride as the later lists of deadly sin will do. For him, it's the last point. It's where you get to once you've succumbed to all the rest. Because pride, in a way, is the point at which you come to the conclusion you don't need God at all. That you've, in a way, made yourself virtuous and holy by your own efforts. And in a way, it's that sort of narcissistic delusion that people in power sometimes get to. Almost every sort of person who's very interested in political life, you find that the trajectory of certain prime ministers is that they get more and more isolated from criticism from colleagues, from people who would tell them how it's really going, to a point at which they really do go slightly bonkers. And pride is the end of that process. Just a brief introduction to Evagrius' teaching on the 8 thoughts and the roots of sin. Of course, what happens with all this is that it gets from east to west, from the Greek world into the Latin world. And as it does so, it changes. I blame John Cassian, who transmitted many of these teachings into the West, partly for this, but also the whole social world that this thinking went into after the fall of the Roman Empire was very different, really. And what you find coming in, which is I think what's affected us in the West bitterly ever since, is this kind of moralizing attitude, so that sin becomes something which is so deeply rooted. Pride is the heart of it, so Adam's pride, in a way, in eating the fruit of the tree and rejecting God, that becomes transmitted almost as a kind of sexual disease down the generations. And we all start from this proud root, which then manifests itself in all sorts of other sins. There are certain medieval churches in this country where you can see a sin tree in the fresco on the wall. And they're rather fascinating to look at, because they show you how, in the Western tradition, pride is the root and the source, and all the other sins sort of derive from it. Where Evagrius has started was, the things which lead to sin are vulnerabilities, which start off with the bodily vulnerabilities, the obvious ones, then grow into the more emotional vulnerabilities, and finally, pride comes at the end of a long sort of process of deterioration, really. So that emphasis is different. The other thing which is different in the West, I think, is that the whole thing becomes a bit moralized and legalistic, so that you become anxious about sin in a quite different way. Sin becomes something that to have an evil thought, to be sort of angry suddenly, is itself a sin. It's not something you stand back and observe. How I am a horrible person that I can have such horrible thoughts. That's the Western trajectory in the way in which this happens. Unless I'm feeling okay, I'm somehow getting it wrong. And I think this is why it's such a difficult and touchy area for all of us. I used to, in my good teenage evangelical days, get absolutely terrified at the Book of Common Prayer communion service, because what would happen if I had an inappropriate, angry or impure thought after the confession, before communion? I couldn't be forgiven, sort of. And I think you do get this terrible sort of picky kind of worried attitude that isn't really quite how Evagrius' diagnostic method was meant to be taken. Interestingly, in the Eastern Church, there's much more of Evagrius' insights. If you go to confession in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you'll virtually find that the liturgy that surrounds the confession of an individual is all about the passions, all about the thoughts, all about, where are they affecting you? And there's much less of a kind of sense that you're at a judgment seat, at a tribunal. How many times did you do it? Was it you? Was it somebody else? No, that's not really a sin. Yes, that is really a sin. That's Western think. In the East, you stand before God with your vulnerabilities. Some you're responsible for, others you aren't. You can't always tell which, but God forgives you anyway. I mean, there's a very much more gentle and subtle and sophisticated view of how we are enmeshed and locked up in stuff which can cause us damage. And also that the way out is through observation, gentleness, patience, prayer, a way out of which we need never, ever despair. Now look, I've only got 10 minutes left, and I think it'd be good if you had something to say. So can I stop there and invite any questions? Would that be all right?
All this is kind of terribly abstract and philosophical. So I thought I'd ask you, where would Evagrius have stood on the question of the devil and his being behind the demons that beset us?
Yes, I could have said a lot about the devil and demonology in general. Evagrius lived in a world which believed that the air was full of spirits, good and bad ones, invisible beings who had certain powers. And he certainly did think that when something goes wrong, you get a coming together of our vulnerability and an outside force. It's never just one or the other. There's something going on. Our vulnerability attracts. It's as if, the bit of me which is hungry and tends to overeat is sending out a signal that the demon of gluttony picks up, and he radiates in, and then the temptation comes between the two. So he does believe in demons in a way that is really difficult and problematic for us. But I do think the important thing here is that he has a language which we in the Western modernity don't really have for the things which are outside us, but also have a tremendous influence. I mean, economic forces, socio-economic bits and pieces, cultural forces, supermarkets, I don't need to demonize supermarkets, but there are all kinds of things out there as well as what's in here. And what he enables us to do, I think, is to name some of the outside stuff as well as the inside stuff. So the language of demons is, although we wouldn't want to use it in quite that way, I think has a usefulness, and we haven't got a language that works very well for that.
You explained at the end the travel of the sin idea from east to west, and it happened that it's in the west more moralistic and more legalistic, but isn't it now just the opposite? It's a sort of psycho battle, from like yes. You are okay, I am okay, you are okay. When you are not moralizing, everybody is okay.
Yes, I think that's what's happened because we haven't got a version of sin which enables us to take it seriously without getting into that either-or state. So either it's nothing at all really, and it's all sort of something we can't do anything about, or we're caught in a mesh of guilt. I mean, quite interestingly, I think, if you talk to people doing therapeutic and counselling work, although what appears on the surface may be total lack of responsibility, total lack of any sense that it's my fault that things have gone wrong, underneath it all there's a terrible fear that it might be. And there's a sort of unspoken guilt. And very often the task of any sort of therapy is really to try to sift out what really does belong to you and what doesn't. And it's the same task as Evagrius was involved in. But we sort of go on a seesaw. We're either responsible for everything or for nothing. We can't find that middle way.
I understand that the word satire derives from sad ire. Is that true? And if so, possibly that explains why there are only 7 deadly sins.
I'm afraid I have no idea about that. I thought it came from the satire that's part of Greek mythology and drama, the sort of spirit figure, and that at the end of a tragedy or a comedy you might have a satire, a sort of something that came at the end of it as a little sort of sideshow. But you may well be right. I don't know the origin of that word, I'm afraid. But the question of why sadness went out is a rather an interesting one. It went out, I think, because the more moralistic world of the West saw sadness as in terms of repentance for sin, a sort of godly grief that was to be seen as a virtue rather than as a problem. And they weren't dealing with this kind of nostalgic aspect of it. I mean, where the nostalgic thing comes to root with us, I think, is where you get people obsessed by the wrongs that have been done to their group or their nation or their people or their family, that can't ever be let go of, that is chewing over and over and over and over. And I think that's that sort of nostalgia for something which can't ever be put right is our sort of cognate of Evagrius' sadness.
Hello.
Yes, sorry.
Does Evagrius' name mean anything like beginning with the Greek EU?
I imagine it is an EU form, but I don't know the rest of it, I'm afraid. Any Greek scholars who could give it a...
Perhaps it's good and sharp.
It could be. I mean, it's quite a well-known name. There are quite a number of people called Evagrius.
I only know of Evagrius through works of Thomas Merton, who found them particularly helpful, especially in terms of thoughts and contemplation. Did Evagrius record anything about his own contemplative practice?
No, he doesn't write autobiographically at all. I mean, you can deduce quite a lot from what he writes and what's written about him. There's a very interesting book by a scholar about how he said the Psalms and about what his, because one of his biographers says he said 100 Psalms a day, which must have taken a lot of time, but has sort of worked out how he might have actually done that and what the physical postures might have been. But he doesn't write personally in that way at all, I'm afraid. I mean, people genuinely didn't at that stage, you don't get sort of spiritual autobiography really until Augustine, not on that kind of level.
This is the last question.
It's not a question, this is trying to get a comment side of what you said. In reading, it may have been Richard in a Richard Rowe book, a trick of, as it were, discerning as it were, skill from genuine guilt. And the kind of thing I find it quite useful, as it were, standing on a bank and watching ships that's coming in and trying to name the ship, as it were, as it passing, in the context, of course, of, as it were, bleeding out of sorts and wanting to discern, well, why am I bleeding out of sorts? And I think that I find that very helpful. And it seems to me that it also does discern, the truth of the thoughts, what I should be repenting about, and what actually, is not to be. Is something like something other.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's very interesting that it isn't really until Ignatius of Loyola that you get a sort of teacher of spiritual life who realized, what Evagrius realized, that the spontaneous thoughts and feelings are really important, that you mustn't prejudge them. And Ignatius understood that very, very well, but very few people in between had.
I'm afraid we have to do it in those hours, it's 1:30, but I must thank you. I'm amazed at how relevant today Evagrius is. Thank you so much.